There are currently 26 million refugees worldwide, resulting from conflicts in dozens of different countries. Ambassador Rick Barton will be here on January 26th to get to the root of that problem. He's going to be discussing the prospects of peaceful democratic change, peace building, and the prevention of conflict. So please check our website at www.sarasota.org in the next few days, and you will be able to register for that event. And so getting back to our tonight's lecture, I would like to talk about COVID, because that's what Richard is going to be talking about. And you know, it seems like the good old days when we used to sit shoulder to shoulder in the auditorium, and we would crowd around the buffet table with our glass of wine, and nobody even owned a mask. So Richard predicted at that time, a year ago, that we would be facing a pandemic. But we thought, you know, it's going to be off in the future someday. Little did we know. Now, here he is back 1 year later, seems like a decade. After 25 years at the World Bank, he was Vice President for International Programs at Population Reference Bureau and Director of the Center for Global Health at the George Washington University. He was the Executive Director of the Harvard PEPFAR program for AIDS treatment in Botswana, Nigeria, and Tanzania. So I will, without further ado, I will leave you in the capable hands of Richard Skolnik with great enthusiasm and a little bit of fear and trepidation about what he might have to say. So, Richard, take it from here.
So thank you very much for the very gracious invitation. It's a special honor, of course, because I spoke with the group last year, and it's not very common that one gets invited back. In fact, it's rare that my friends ever invite me back, so I'm very honored and very touched. You'll remember that last year, I was asked to speak on the topic, why one should care about global health. And Lynn Nadd and I decided that the talk this year will be called, Why You Should Now Care Even More About Global Health. I suggested last year a number of reasons why global health should be so important to all of us. One of them was the risks posed by emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. I specifically noted, and I didn't try to be prescient, and I'm not sure it was that difficult, but I specifically noted that the world was poorly prepared to deal with such diseases. And I, in addition, suggested that these diseases have always been around, they would continue to be around, and that unless the world got much better prepared to engage in pandemic surveillance and response, as a world, we were really at grave risk of being overrun by a pandemic. I didn't suggest when this might occur. I think everyone in the global health business thought just like I did. And of course, I'm sorry that this came to pass. As the organizers have requested, I'm going to make some remarks tonight about what's happened to the world in the last year, why the virus has struck such a terrible blow to the United States, and what this means for how much you should care about global health now. I'm also going to make some suggestions about how the US can more effectively address the pandemic and prepare for future outbreaks. And finally, I'm going to end with some thoughts about a few important global health challenges ahead beyond COVID. I want to remind you that there are people who can speak much more authoritatively about COVID than I can. But I'll remind you, as I think I said last year, that when someone introduced me recently as one of the leading authorities in the world on maternal and child health globally, I corrected the very gracious person and said, I want to remind you, I'm not one of the leading authorities in the world on maternal and child health. However, I said, pointing my finger, my friends are the leading authorities on maternal and child health, and they universally agree that I am the leading authority in the world on paraphrasing the leading authorities. So on the one hand, I hope that some of my ideas will be, I hope all of my ideas will be thoughtful. I'm happy to take responsibility for everything I say, but I want to remind you that there are people who can speak much more authoritatively about, certainly about COVID. I'm going to be very candid in my remarks. I'm going to give you my thoughts without holding anything back. I'm going to try to ensure that everything I say is based on facts. If you have questions about that, you are more than welcome to ask. And I want to tell you now, some of what I regard as facts, which I hope you'll regard as facts, are not comfortable facts and help to land us where we are today. So what's happened since we last met? In the last year, as you know, 67 million people globally have been infected with COVID-19, and 1.5 million people have died of it. Since my talk last year, almost 15 million people have been infected with COVID-19 in the United States, and nearly 300,000 people have died of it. In addition, in the last month alone, as you know, we've had a terrible surge of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths, both in the United States and in many other countries. Now, linked to this, I want to put the pandemic in the US in perspective by reminding you that many countries face much lower rates of infection and much lower rates of death. The risk of being infected from COVID-19 in the United States is about 50 times greater than the risk of being infected with COVID-19 in South Korea. The risk of dying from COVID-19 in the United States is about 80 times greater than the risk of dying from COVID-19 in South Korea. And I think it's extraordinarily important that when we think about the US, no matter how unique we think we are as a country and as a people, that we put our pandemic into a global perspective, which I don't need to remind you about, since this is what all of you have always been about. Now, how did this happen in the United States? I think it's true that the Chinese failed in a timely way to transparently bring to the attention of the rest of the world what they were beginning to face in China, as it became clear that this was an emerging infectious disease and one that was potentially lethal and difficult to handle. However, I can't accept this in any way, shape, or form as an excuse for the US's failure to suppress the virus. When we look at countries such as Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam, for example, we see countries that had exactly the same information we had at exactly the same time, that were closer to China than us, but actually managed to suppress the virus and to a very large extent have been able to keep it suppressed. In addition, and I think I mentioned this last year, everyone involved in global health has been saying for a very long time that we needed, as a world and as individual countries, to be ready to deal with the pandemic because of the certainty of the continuing emergence of diseases and the reemergence of other diseases. I'm sure you've read about Bill Gates's famous talk 3 years ago. You know what Laurie Garrett said in her book. The first edition of my book came out in 2007 and said this would happen. And just before the Trump administration took office, Dr. Fauci was a major actor in a seminar at the Georgetown University, which was called Preparing the Next Administration for the Pandemic to Come. So I think the short answer to what happened is that we failed miserably as a country to take needed and well-known public health measures in a timely manner. Then the virus overran us, and it overran us so much that we were no longer in a position to take those public health measures, to engage in good public health work, and we wound up in a kind of downward spiral. In many ways, I think we're still in that spiral. Let me elaborate a bit. And Nat and Lynn know I'm really a pretty funny guy. I hope that if they invite me back next year for the annual Skolnik lecture, not yet memorial, that they'll give me something happy to talk about. But I'm going to do the best I can in trying, as I said, to be candid and fact-based. So I want to suggest several reasons why the virus has, in my view, so badly defeated us so far. My comments will largely refer to the federal government, but in many respects, they refer as well to the inaction or wrong actions or non-evidence-based actions of a substantial number of state governments as well. So first, I want to suggest that we faced a weak and very slow response. The federal government ignored early information about the outbreak and was very slow to respond to it. And remember, and I can share with Nat to share with all of you an article I wrote that tries to remind people, a week in a life isn't a big deal. A week in a pandemic is an eternity because of the doubling time and the time of reproduction of the virus. Two, the federal administration was very reluctant to invoke the Defense Production Act and didn't have in place any of what we call advanced market commitments, which it could have triggered immediately. Three, the federal government left most procurement as a kind of free-for-all to the states. And four, we faced almost uniquely as a country a very varied response to the outbreak that wasn't based on the epidemiology locally. It was based much more on politics, politicization, the lack of consensus in the United States, the extent to which we're polarized as a country. I also want to suggest to you that a second problem was poor quality messaging and the politicization of the outbreak and the muzzling of science. The federal government's messaging and the messaging of a lot of states as well was late, it was inconsistent, it was often not based on evidence, and often it was polarizing. And then in addition, there were other measures that the federal government and some state governments took as well to further politicize the outbreak, to turn it into black, if you do this, and white if you do that, and to muzzle the scientists. Some of this muzzling was the muzzling of CDC. Some of it was the muzzling of NIH. Some of it, even at state governments, was the muzzling of people who were responsible for putting out the data dashboards on a regular basis. Third, I want to suggest to you that at one time, this US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was the envy of the world. I used to tell my students that, and I should mention that when I left the World Bank, I taught both at the George Washington University and then later at Yale as well. And I used to tell my students, even the French, même les Français, as many of you would say, even the French call CDC when they have a problem. CDC were really the epidemiologists of the world. And I used to tell my students the three best initials you can have after your name professionally are CDC. And yet I don't know anyone in my business who doesn't believe that CDC has really been decimated by the manner in which it's been treated by both the federal administration, but also by its own leader, Dr. Redfield. It's certainly true that they made some early mistakes. They were then sidelined, and they, until the last few weeks, have really been largely absent. Data was taken away from them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, this is an organization that once was so valued throughout the world, but in the early days of this pandemic, they sent a note to my son and his friends who are critical care specialists saying, in the absence of personal protective equipment, use a bandana. My son works on COVID-19 patients. He intubates COVID-19 patients. These people aerosolize the virus. And an organization which was once the envy of all of the world, even the French, sent a note to physicians saying, if you have to, use a bandana. That's the level to which we have sunk in many regards in our response to the pandemic. And then, I think in addition, I'm not sure that we as a country, although some states did, ever really sought to suppress the virus. I think from the federal government's point of view, it washed its hands pretty early of this. It left it to the states. So there were some states that wanted to be New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, Hong Kong. But there were others that didn't seek to suppress the virus. And in the end, this also contributed to the virus basically taking control of us rather than our taking control of the virus. So where is this going? I don't need to be a soothsayer to say what you already know, which is every indication is that the number of infections and deaths is going to continue to increase in the coming months. It's going to be fueled by politics. It's going to be fueled by fatigue. It's going to be fueled by Thanksgiving. It's going to be fueled by Christmas and the New Year. And it's going to continue to be fueled by inattention and poor policy choices, both at the federal level and at the level of some states. So I think the likelihood that in the next few months, we're going to miraculously turn this around and suppress the virus is absolutely zero. And we can talk later about what the vaccine might mean for the suppression of the virus. So let me pick up then on the topic of the talk for just a couple seconds, and that is, why should you care about global health even more than I suggested you should care about it last year? Well, I mentioned last year, and all of you know very well, the importance of a healthy population to a society's overall social and economic well-being. But I think COVID-19, to an extent we've never seen before on such a scale, has made extraordinarily clear the centrality of public health, not only to our health, but also to our economic well-being, our educational well-being, our psychological well-being, and our stability as a nation and as a world. Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard University, the former Treasury Secretary and economist at Harvard, estimated some months ago that the cost to the United States at that time of COVID-19 had already hit direct and indirect costs over $16 trillion. And that means, of course, that if we had been willing to spend up to 15 trillion, 0.999, we might still have gotten a pretty good economic reasonable return on such an investment. So I can't think of a higher return than we could achieve by investing in wise policy choices to address public health, disease surveillance, pandemic response, and to try to put an end to this virus in the United States as quickly as possible. And I've been shocked, if not appalled, over the last 7 or 8 months at the extent to which even very well-known economists regularly said on the NewsHour and in other fora what needed to be done to get the economy going again. In my view, and I think the view of people I respect like Larry Summers and many others, we need to understand this shock to the economy is inspired by a virus. This isn't because we printed too much money, or it's because IT sector has been hit with X, Y, or Z. We are suffering a terrible economic shock, both domestically and globally, because of a virus. And I think we're completely and utterly kidding ourselves if we believe there's any amount of stimulus that is going to get over this, because you're not going to go out of your house. You're not going to go eat inside. You're not going to go shopping like you used to. You're not going to get on an airplane. No matter how much money they give you as a stimulus, you're not going to do that until the virus is addressed. And we must get this thing under control. So what do I think is going to happen, and what do I recommend gratuitously to the new president? My guess is that President Trump will, by and large, ignore the virus now. That most of the attention of people in his administration will be focused on vaccines. I think the CDC has shown now that it's beginning to speak out again, almost as if they were allowed to. And I think you'll see Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx speaking out much more than before as well. My guess is that we will make some progress on vaccines, but if it's true that by the end of December, we're only going to have 40 million doses of vaccines, On the one hand, this would be miraculous compared to the time it's taken to develop any prior vaccines. On the other hand, it'll be 40 million doses of vaccine, not the 100 million doses of vaccine that the administration had been talking about earlier. So I think that most of the hard work of addressing the vaccine will fall to the next administration. And I'm fortunate in having worked with some people who will be working with the new administration. I do my best without being asked to influence them. But let me tell you, if they did ask, what do I think should be done? And I'm going to put this in 3 or 4 categories, and then we'll just about on time be ready to open it up. One is messaging. We need to engage in clear, consistent messaging from the top down at every level. It needs to be based on science, and we need to help everybody understand what needs to be done in such a way that we create much more confidence in the efforts that are being undertaken and the choices that we're making as a nation, and certainly in the vaccine as it begins to get rolled out. I saw a good piece today, and I have to agree. I think we should dramatically change our advertising about COVID-19. I think we should stop with the article today called the Mr. Rogers advertising approach, which is be a good person, wear a mask. I think we need to get cameras into the ICUs in South Dakota and in Iowa, and we need to show the American people pictures of some of the 238,000 people as they've been dying, and let them understand the extraordinary extent to which this disease is for real. It's serious. It's going to kill about 1.5% of the people who get it. It's going to overwhelm our hospitals and our intensive care units, and it's going to continue to exact a horrific psychological, educational, and economic toll until we get it under control. I can't think, I'm not sure this will work because we're so divided as a people, but I'm sure that the approach we're taking is absolutely not working. We need to strengthen dramatically the coordination and the transparency of Operation Warp Speed. I aggravated my friends no end when I sent them a quote from the president of Pfizer the other day, which I thought thoroughly confused people, and my friends were thoroughly confused about how this vaccine and the Moderna vaccine will work. We need to be sure that on the vaccine, we do everything we possibly can to see that as large a share of the adult population as possible takes the vaccine, wants to take the vaccine, if the FDA deems it to be safe and effective. And we need to ensure that the messaging about this is simple, it's clear, it's engaging, and it helps convince people, including people on the margin, why this is so important. And we need to take a very similar approach to the continuing preparation of diagnostics, drugs, and additional vaccines, which need to be examined according to the best available science, so that Americans, many of whom doubt that that's the case, will become more confident about the quality of our government in assessing the safety and efficacy of these drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. And we need to join the International Coalition on Vaccines, because we need to understand, as long as the vaccine is circulating someplace, unless we really do achieve herd immunity through vaccination here, if it's in Liberia, Nigeria, Germany, Belgium, Guatemala, Honduras, we're all in this together, as I said last year. My book opens up, and I'll repeat, the health of anyone, anywhere is the health of everyone, everywhere. CDC needs to be, depends on your religious preference, it either needs to be revived or it needs to be resurrected. Even some of my most religious Christian friends believe resurrected is not strong enough a word, given the extent to which CDC is sunk as an organization. You've probably read that President-elect Biden is going to appoint Rochelle Walensky from the Mass General Hospital and Harvard Med School, and certainly everybody that I know believes that she's a person of extraordinary talents who will be a very good choice for CDC. We need to, it'll be somewhat symbolic because the feds don't control everything. I think the new president will suggest that a mask must be worn in all federal facilities. I think we need to not hesitate to continue invoking the Defense Production Act and now arrange advanced market commitments so the things we need later can much more quickly be had. We need to, I think, do a better job both at the state and federal level at using epidemiology more. I'm very sympathetic and agree with the idea that it makes no sense to keep bars open and schools closed. I think what we need, on the other hand, if you have rates of transmission that are over 5, 6, 7 per 100,000, it also makes no sense to open your schools because the kids, the teachers will be at risk and they'll help to fuel this. This is a difficult one. I think we need to put science in the forefront. We need to come much more to consensus as states and communities. And finally, I think we need to launch a universal testing program, a lot like that suggested by Dr. Mina at Harvard, in which everybody would get in the mail twice a week a paper test strip for testing themselves with instructions on what to do if you test positive. The Rwandans can return a PCR test to their population in 2 hours via cell phone. And we have people in the United States still waiting 3, 4, 5, 6 days, in which case, as you know, the testing is almost no consequence except for record keeping. I think testing has its place, and I think only if we move to these rapid tests given repeatedly at very cheap rates to everybody in the population, I don't think we're going to get there, and I don't think it'll take very long time before the vaccine and the measures we're taking now will get us there alone. And finally, I think we need to rejoin the World Health Organization, but we need to help WHO get over its hangups about sovereignty. For a while, some years ago, it looked like they were going to, but we can't just have WHO continue, and I understand why. I worked in international organizations, accept what everybody says all the time, but it's a very difficult thing to do, and I hope that we can help them instead of walking away from them. And lastly, we need to prepare now for the next pandemic. It's going to happen, and again, through Defense Production Act, advanced market commitments, et cetera. And part of that has to be serious investing in the public health personnel we need to manage a pandemic, to manage pandemic surveillance and response. The 2008 financial crisis led to a decrease by over 20% in public health people at state and local authorities. And in the last year alone, another 8,000 of those people are gone. It's another reason why we shouldn't be surprised at some of the gaps in what we're doing. Let me stop here, and in response to one or two of the questions, I'll make a few comments about some of the other things I think the next administration will have to worry about, even though what they'll have on their plate for COVID-19 is just going to be an enormous burden on the health side, not to mention trying to help revive the American economy, American schooling, and the overall well-being of the American people. So I thank you again for the very gracious invitation. I hope I'm sure it's clear to all of you what's going on. I hope I've added a little bit of enlightenment in terms of why we got where we are, how we got where we are, and what might be done to address it as fast as possible in cost-efficient, doable, sustainable, and ethically sensitive ways. So let me stop there, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Wesley, who's going to go ahead and lead the Q&A. But I thank you all very much again, and I very much look forward to learning from all of you. If it's convenient for you, please don't hesitate to turn on your video, because that way I can see much better how you're responding to each other and to myself. Please go ahead, Wesley.
Well, Rich, let me just first thank you before I turn it over to Wesley to moderate our Q&A. As usual, you've both been incredibly insightful and informative, but also pretty scary, I must say. But prepare yourself to be invited back next year, and hopefully the news will be much better. On that note, let me turn it over to Wesley Beggs, who is one of our newest board members, and she will moderate the Q&A for us. Wes, it's all yours.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for that informative and insightful, not to mention timely discussion, and thank you for coming back for round 2 here at the Sarasota World Affairs Council. So I'm going to start off with a question from our board member who you heard from earlier this evening, Lynn Partington. And I'm going to ask that everybody, if you have a question for our speaker, to pop it in the chat, and I will read them off as they come in, if that's all right with you, Richard. So we've heard a lot of talk about a vaccine. And can you comment on what that distribution process may look like and potential side effects that people can be prepared for?
So again, there are a large number of people are much more competent than I to speak with authority on this, but I do keep track. So as you know, there's a substantial number of vaccines in trial all over the world, including US, the UK, Russia, and China. As you also know, 2 of the vaccines now completed their phase 3 clinical trials. And that's the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. And the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is very close to completing phase 3 of its trials. I think, as you also know, in collaboration with the United States, and I give the US federal government substantial credit for this, arrangements were made to try to ensure that a vaccine, A, could be developed as rapidly as possible, and B, that the vaccine could be produced and distributed as fast as possible. So the US provided a substantial number of incentives to help defray what other might have been the cost of research and development, some of the risks that might go with that, and did the same for production. So it's my understanding that between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, that by the end of the year, I think the best estimates now, and this was coming from the CEO, might have seen on Dateline the other night, is that 40 million doses of the vaccine will be available by the end of the year, which means enough to vaccinate 20 million people. CDC has issued guidelines for the criteria and principle that should govern the decisions about who gets seen first. They suggest frontline health workers should be first, and that would include frontline health workers at care facilities such as nursing homes. The US has set it up so that the US military is going to be helping with the logistical arrangements, as are a number of private sector organizations. Because I'm sure you've read the logistical arrangements for getting 40 million doses spread out 3 weeks apart to 20 million people, and vaccinating adults, not kids, which everybody's better at, will be enormous. They're complicated by the fact one of the vaccines has to be kept at a temperature at 70 degrees Celsius below. And so the firm has produced, as I'm sure you've seen and read about, cold packs and arrangement, different kinds of freezers and other things that can help them to do this. And the US military and everybody else, CVS, Walgreens, et cetera, will be assisting in getting these vaccines out. I think the messaging has been very confusing, and I got beat up for saying that, but then gave notes to my friends who showed it. From what I understand, and replacing the CEOs of these companies or everybody else, because it's only when the information becomes more transparently in the next few weeks as the FDA considers them for emergency use authorization that we'll really have a clearer story. But it appears that both of the first 2 vaccines are around 95% effective in stopping infection. And that in addition, the vaccines claim that it was about 100% effective in ensuring that none of the people who took it progressed to severe COVID-19 disease. If these numbers hold up, they would be very good. The measles vaccine example, which is a vaccine against a potentially disease, historically in high-income countries and still in low-income countries, measles vaccine with a booster is 97% effective. It's about 92 without and 97 with. And that's another issue, of course, is the booster shot. Not only will we reach Lynn and Wesley and Barbara and me and Robert and Wanda, but we're also going to have to reach us 3 weeks later and ensure that the vaccine is still viable at that time, given the circumstances under which it has to be stored. People have suggested that, I don't know, many of you might have taken the new shingles shot. The old shingles shot didn't produce many side effects, but the new one, everybody I know who took it, my wife and I, found it the most miserable side of any vaccine we'd ever taken. I think what some people say is you should be prepared when you take the first dose, I think it was the first dose, to have a little bit of a flu-like symptoms with fever, headache, discomfort, nausea, etc. I think they suggested that the second, that the booster did not produce these effects, but I won't swear to it. And I think what we'll be seeing, Wesley, is, and others, is over time, starting with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, we're going to be seeing, and Johnson & Johnson probably after that, we'll be seeing more vaccines in the hopes, I think, that as people were writing about today, that it's possible that adults will be vaccinated by the summer of 2020, starting with healthcare workers, then nursing home residents, then older people with existing conditions, diabetes, then the general adult population. Now, the last thing I'll say is, as you probably know, kids tend not to get sick. Kids get sick, but kids get infected, but they tend not to get very sick. There is this multi-system inflammatory syndrome that has rarely and very nastily occurred. But one of the companies has just announced that they will be doing clinical trials on kids 12 to 17. But the kids are an issue because no one is planning yet to do any trials on real pediatric trials. And we'll have to see what happens with that. So I think the most optimistic folks believe that by the end of the summer, it's possible that everyone who wants to be vaccinated will be vaccinated, that there will be enormous issues in the United States, convincing over 1% or 75% of the adults to be vaccinated, which we need to achieve herd immunity vaccination. And that for some time to come, we will continue to need to wear masks, engage in social distancing, et cetera. I apologize, but I wanted to go step by step because I think failing to do that would have been probably, at least for me, more confusing than enlightening.
Well, it was certainly enlightening. So our next question is from another board member, Virginia Hitchcock. Would you please describe post-COVID syndrome and if there is any way to lessen the effects of it?
So let me say this first. This is an opinion, but it's evidence-based. I used to tell my students when I taught, if I ever issue an opinion and I don't admit it first, I'll take you to dinner for a week's expense. So opinion, but it's evidence-based. I think the United States has made another very serious mistake at the federal level, but also at the level of many states in the way it's thought about COVID-19. Over and over and over again, our federal authorities talked about death rates, or how we were bringing the death rate down. But I think they were missing the point. You don't get sick, you don't go to a hospital, you don't go to an ICU, and you don't die if you don't get infected. And the costs of infection are enormous. If you are infected, you're supposed to stay home for 2 weeks. If you didn't get sick, it could take long. If you're infected and you go to the hospital, it could take longer still. And if you're infected, go to the ICU, it's enormously expensive and taxing. And then if you die, all your future years of social relationships and income earning are gone. And I think we have in the global health business something called disability adjusted life years that tries to measure the real costs of ill health that include morbidity, disability, and death. And I think we've really made a mistake by focusing much too much on deaths and failing to appreciate infections. So on the infection side, I think we're facing what everybody, I think, all the science community, I think, regards as real, which is a thing called long COVID. And that is people who were infected with the virus, they may have had varying levels of severity of the infection, but they don't recover very quickly. And some of them now 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months into the post recovery, post-infection, forgive me, are still suffering renal, pulmonary, cardiac, psychological or neurological effects. And I'm sure you've seen this. There are some, very sadly, the leading scientific researcher on this, as you might have read, actually died last week herself in her early 60s of a heart attack. I think she was at Mount Sinai. And there are other people who are working on this now. But I think one really important scientific question is, what is the extent of infection at different levels of severity produce different types of after effects and for how long they will last. Is it possible that you can be infected, get symptoms, and then when you're a 33-year-old male who's newly married and trying to get a baby, find out that you're sterile, and this has something to do with the fact that you had COVID-19 or an enlarged heart, or your kidneys aren't working as well. I know people who are physicians who are keeping their kids out of school, not that the kid will be infected and get multi-system inflammatory syndrome, but out of fear of the unknown and the fear that we just don't know enough about what are the medium and longer run effects of different levels of severity of illness or even just infection. So I think, Wesley, that's probably the best that I can say, that these are really interesting and important scientific questions. I think Dr. Fauci mentioned there's an important study that they've launched recently or will be. There's a lot of other very good work. I think Mount Sinai is the center of the universe for work on long COVID. And, I'm hoping they'll put a very small share. The best case is a share of people who get severe disease will wind up with long-lasting disabilities. The worst possible case would be many people, an important share of those, including some people who may even have been asymptomatic, will wind up with post-COVID illness or later disability. And I think people just don't know, but they do know many people are not recovering an important share, I think it's something like 10 or so, I could be wrong, are not recovering speedily.
Wow. And then one more question from the board member.
I'm really hoping you'll give me that. I can get my guitar and sing happy songs.
We'll take one more from another board member, and then we'll move on to member questions. So this one is from Professor Barbara Hicks at New College of Florida. And as we look out to what other diseases and viruses may be coming forward in the future, do you expect more frequent cross-species mutation or infection?
So I'm not competent to address scientific aspects of the mutations. So with permission of Professor Hicks, let me take the broader question. And that is, what should we expect in terms of emerging and re-emerging diseases? Do we expect them to continue to occur and or to occur more frequently? I think the people who know the most about this, and it's Dr. Fauci, who is really the leading authority on this, but David Heyman, who used to be Deputy Director General at WHO, who's in the London School now, he's another great authority. I mean, certainly I think they would suggest that we need to be prepared for the possibility that diseases will emerge and reemerge, and reemergence might include some of that mutation, frequently than before, because the population is growing. Populations are pushing out into areas where there weren't people traditionally. There's more and more contact with animals, and almost all of these diseases are zoonotic. And climate change as well might alter some of the factors related to the transmission of disease and infection. So I think the most prudent policy course for any country would be to assume that we're very likely to face more frequent and more emerging and recurring diseases, need to be much better prepared as a world to
and so
another happy response.
I know, it's such a sunshiny subject, so we're going to keep falling into this trap, I suspect. So this next question is from John McCoward. What are risks from terrorist groups and rogue nations of weaponizing viruses?
I'm not at all agree on this, and I intentionally didn't include bioterrorism in my book or in my classes. But I understand that malevolent people could, if they wanted to, weaponize any number of systems without much difficulty. For example, at one time on the web, there was information about how to make polio in a bottle. At other times on the web, there's been information about other viruses. So I believe that the federal authorities in the United States are very conscious of and concerned about possibility, and and are continuing to develop sniffers and virus finders and other things. I'm sure it's happening here. I live in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I'm sure folks at the lab are working on this because of what I've said about as the relative ease of this being done by people if they wish to do so. Now, some of these viruses would cause a whole lot more problems than others. Some might not be so deadly, but imagine if even a polio virus were released into unimmunized populations. I'm old enough to remember, of course, what this was all about. So I understand this is a significant risk. The studies that were done late last year that I mentioned to you from the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Hopkins and from the Center for Strategic and National Studies all did include preparation for dealing with bioterrorism. They did also say that the US was the best prepared of all the countries, but I remind you, the US was also given only a 70 out of 100. And let me say, Wesley, if I might, one last thing. You could say, how is this possible? Richard, last year you told us that the US is regarded as the best prepared country in the world and was given a 70 out of 100. And this is true, but I could tell you a joke, I probably won't. You remember, if a boxer gets out, doesn't matter what religion he is, and he prays to whatever he believes, but he can't box very well, it's likely that the prayers really won't help him very much. And I have an ethnic about that. I'll tell you all more privately another time. And the things that CSIS and the Nuclear Threat Initiative in Hopkins did not take account of willingness to act or ability to execute. They looked at as if you were that if you had the capacity, you would use it. Well, we as a nation had much of the capacity and either didn't use it, delayed using it, or often didn't use it according to the best available evidence. And I think that also helps to explain some of what happened. But bioterrorism, I think if you talk to your old friends, many of you in government, I believe they'll tell you there's still continuing since the World Trade Towers, since 9/11, there's considerable attention still being paid to that, and a substantial concern that some viruses could be weaponized. And bacteria too. Anthrax is a bacteria, right?
And our next question is from Ann Searing. How do you think the trade-offs compare between in-person and remote learning on the progress of low-income children?
So, deeply honored you are so who also worked as NatNo for education. Let me try to give you a response born from trying to keep up with all these things, but not being an authority on it. My understanding is that there are enormous difficulties providing remote education to children from marginalized families, poor families, and children with special needs. And New Mexico is a good example. I mean, where the governor has tried very hard to create a very equitable approach to education during the pandemic. But as many of you know, New Mexico has the largest share of Native Americans in the population as a whole of any state except for Alaska. And many of our Native American, we have a county that's at the heart of the Navajo Nation, which McKinley County, New Mexico, where Gallup is. It's $100 richer than the poorest county in the United States. You go there, those of you who've been in Honduras, Guatemala, Chiapas, you'll recognize it. It looks just like a lot of the places in lower middle income countries in which many of us have spent so much of our life. About a third of the Navajo Nation doesn't have running water. Almost everybody lives in many people live in substandard. The houses are often crowded. For cultural reasons, they're often multi-generational, which I think is a great thing, but they're also often crowded. And an important share of the communities don't have access to high-speed internet. Well, that sounds like a disaster in terms of trying to ensure that and the distances are vast. So in principle, like in Alaska, remote education actually have done well, and with a good foundation, might be among the few things you could do, because you could use master teachers, you could do all sorts of things. But there are substantial gaps. And I read today that suggested something like 20% of the kids in the United States are not even going to school at all now. I mean, the most recent survey showed a substantial share of kids just aren't going to school, or they're not signing up, or they're showing up a little bit. And then when it comes to children with special needs, I don't worry so much about the children whose special needs are on the side of so-called gifted and talented kids, because they will tend to come. They will tend to come more from families that have the means to engage in remote education. Not all of them, but they will have a head start, and they'll have a better ability to catch up when they go back to school. I worry terribly about kids who suffer autism spectrum disorders and have other developmental disabilities. We have here in Los Alamos, I think, a program that's shown itself to be excellent in outcomes for student well-being. We have a preschool in which there's kids with developmental disabilities, 3 of them per preschool class, coupled with 2 kids who are not suffering developmental disabilities, who are peers. And my granddaughter was a peer for 2 years in that program. And you couldn't find more loving, more caring teachers. You couldn't find a school system, really with better resources than we have here, et cetera. And I can only think, even for those kids now, and we have a system with sending teachers to them, it must be incredibly difficult for the students and for the families to maintain their development trajectory with the help of the school system. And you've all read about the enormous challenges for other children in much less good circumstances than Los Alamos, New Mexico. So I think, we're probably looking at kids who are part of a lost generation. The most marginalized will be severely thrown back. The most developmentally disabled will be thrown back. More than that, only in the best systems will they be getting the support that they need in anything like they got it before. And I do think it's incumbent on the systems, and I'm not sure how much they're doing it. And Nat knows more about this than any of us on the call. Education folks aren't great at measuring educational outcomes. And I hope, but I'm not at all confident, that school systems today that are competent will actually be looking at all of these things and taking whatever generalizable lessons they can to try to enhance the quality of learning and well-being outcomes for their students later. One last thing, if I may, having said this, from up here, the hybrid was very thoughtfully put together, but fully remote learning up here, where most of the kids come from families that are very well educated and have means. The remote learning up here from the beginning of the year has produced educational outcomes by everyone's assessment immeasurably greater than the hybrid, because the hybrid, they were going 2 days a week. They only had a limited number of contact hours. Wednesday was no school. Thursday, Friday, they were going remote. The remote has been 7 hours a day, 5 days a week from the beginning. It's online instruction. And I think history will record this isn't good for everybody. But in a place like this, or the better off places around where you are, or the northern suburbs of Chicago, I think my own understanding is, carefully prepared remote may be producing better educational outcomes than the hybrid. And everybody should take a look at the article Erica Christakis wrote in The Atlantic this month about what's it worth sending your kids to school when they're 6 feet away from everybody else with plexiglass barriers and masks on. I'm not suggesting, I'm not competent to judge, but Dr. Christakis has raised some really interesting issues about in-person schooling under certain circumstances. So my heart goes out to all of these kids and all their families. I think it's, I hope this will end as soon as possible. And I'm a grandfather who's been spending 5 hours a day with his grandchildren.
Yeah, I think we're all hoping for some level of return to normalcy relatively soon. So our next question is from Lori Stryker. What are vaccine costs per person, and should we wait for a one-shot or the Johnson & Johnson option?
That's a good question. So Lori, I don't know the answer to that. I believe what is being done, the answer in principle is that the federal government's going to be defraying the cost of the vaccine, which should be free to everybody. Now, some things I read today or heard today were a little bit contradictory, because I think what it said is if you have insurance, your insurance company should pay for it. If you don't, the federal government will be bearing the cost. But it's my understanding that COVID vaccines will be free to everybody. Should one wait for a single dose vaccine or for a dose vaccine with lower side effects? I think the answer there has to do with your own benefit cost calculus. I think we all have to ask ourselves, based on the best available knowledge of each vaccine, what is the extent to which we think the benefits of getting it today, tomorrow, or the next day outweigh the costs, and how those possible benefits and costs over time relate to the possibility that there'll be a safer, more efficacious vaccine with fewer side effects and longer immunity. I think we're going to be dealing, unfortunately, with a lot of unknowns, but I think we're going to have to just each of us do the best we can. I'm sure there'll be lots written about this, but I think we're going to have to each of us do the best we can to make reasonable judgments for ourselves about where we are in that cost-benefit spectrum.
And then next up from Jack Siegel, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA director, today said that he believes that by March, anyone who wants to be immunized will have access to COVID vaccines. Assuming that is correct and that most people do in fact get vaccinated, will it be safe once again to open businesses, schools, and social gatherings by April?
So, Dr. Gottlieb is a smart guy, and I appreciate his contributions. And I've seen, some people saying June, July, some people saying March. I'm not sure. It'll matter enormously to us, but in terms of this question, I don't really know the answer. In fact, today I was in touch with some of the great infectious disease people trying to get a clearer answer. So far, what I've heard, and you may have heard it too, is that until a much larger share of the population is immunized, the CDC will continue to recommend that people continue to social distance and mask, and until we have a much clearer understanding of lower levels of transmission of the virus. I don't know the extent to which kids will remain a kind of wild card in this, either in terms of our concern about their being infected or our concerns about residuals of infection residing in kids who then can continue to spread it to the unimmunized if we don't get herd immunity. But I think the answer I've heard over and over again is, at least until we go much further toward the point that the questioner raised, we will continue to be encouraged to socially distance and wear masks and avoid crowds, while looking forward to the time when CDC suggests that the rate of transmission is low enough that we can resume a more normal life. And hopefully by then, some of those residual concerns like kids will, vaccines for kids will be addressed. I can only tell you, what I've heard. It would be great if the vaccine manufacturers could answer, and I think we'll know more after the FDA hearings on emergency authorization use. Authorization.
These next couple questions are very much in that same vein, from Chris and Tom Sloan and Jeanette Gatesy. How long is the vaccine effective for? Will you need to be revaccinated? And kind of touching on what you were just talking about, will you have to wear a mask once you've been vaccinated? So
the first question, I think people have been unequivocally clear on, and I sent my friends quotes today from the CEOs of Pfizer and Moderna, but no one knows. I think the answer is, so far the answer that has consistently been given is no one knows yet for how long immunity will last after you've been vaccinated. They'll be looking at this very, very carefully. After a vaccine gets put into wide use, they have what's called phase 4. They'll be collecting information on adverse effects, events, and trying to understand better. But everyone that I've seen, heard, and read, including some of the gurus with whom I was in touch today, have said unequivocally, no one knows yet for how long immunity will last. And you could go, eventually they'll post the dateline of December 4th, Dateline NBC, of December 4, which had interviews with the CEOs of Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J. And you'll hear all three of the CEOs say that themselves.
Well, if you'll continue indulging us, we still have a couple more
No,
questions.
I'm at your disposal. I'm honored. I'm honored by the invitation, and I very much appreciate the very thoughtful questions.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time again. So this next one is from Lee Bushler. Over time, will one be able to take more than one vaccine, as is possible with polio, and can doing so improve one's
That is a
immunity?
great question. I promise to ask the gurus. I'm not important, but some of my friends are, and they've been very gracious. It is a very good question. I think it's on the minds of many people. It's very thoughtful, and I don't know. I have not yet seen the answer. I know, as a non-scientist, one of the questions that some people raised earlier about the vaccine was, what is the extent to which the vaccine itself, by producing antibody, by doing the vaccine thing and enabling the production of antibodies, might in some people create cytokine storms, might actually produce antibodies that threw them over the edge, because that's some of what appeared to be happening in some people as they got sick from COVID. And I believe there was earlier work on a coronavirus vaccine that suffered some of those difficulties. That is a very good question. I promise to seek an answer from people much more knowledgeable than me, and then I'll get the answer to Lynn and you and Nat, Wesley, and you can share it with your constituents. Of course, it's interesting on polio, and I'm 71. Wesley, thank you, despite the fact that I don't look it, I appreciate that. But, of course, I lived in a world that was dominated by polio. I used to tell my students, I don't swim very well, because every time, I'm a Chicagoan by birth, every time you wanted to go swimming, you couldn't go. You couldn't go to a congregate setting. You couldn't go to the lake. It's polio season, etc. I mean, I don't swim very well for a bunch of reasons, but one of them really is polio. And of course, the polio vaccine, one of them is live and one of them is killed. And one of them, the live one, actually produces some cases of vaccine-derived polio itself, which is a really interesting issue. Polio, by the way, I worked on internationally for a long time, and was really honored to work with some great folks who've devoted their life to trying to eradicate polio. And your parallel is a really interesting one. I just absolutely don't know the answer, but I promise to try to get one for you.
Well, if you do get one, we'll be happy to send it out. Next question was sent in by Sheila Coletta. Have we learned any lessons from Sweden or New Zealand that we can apply here?
So I think that there are many very thoughtful people in government, in civil society, in academia, who have looked carefully at the experience with COVID-19 in a number of countries. And I tried in my own comments about what I would tell the president to do, to try to bring together some of what I believe those thoughtful people would say if they were asked about what we, might have learned from the experience of other countries, both positive and negative. Sweden is a really interesting case. There's a seminar, I think tomorrow, from CSIS that's going to feature the Swedish chief epidemiologist, who's all over the news all the time. And you might check the CSIS webpage for that one. And I think the word is, my own view, which is can be a view, is that I think it will be really interesting over time to continue, it will be necessary over time to continue following the experience of a substantial number of countries, and then on a regular basis, trying to derive lessons from those experiences. And there are those who think that the Swedes are the greatest thing since sliced bread. Some of the Swedes think the government truly threw grandma off the train without any prospects for care when it was going through their care homes. Other people believe that the Swedes have done it right. Most people believe, certainly in the US scientific community, that trying to achieve herd immunity through infection is madness, because the cost to you in terms of the number of people who would have to be infected, and therefore the number who would be hospitalized and the number who would die, would be so overwhelming that if people understood that, they would never tolerate it in economic, social, or health terms. So I think there are lots of thought. I mean, I think, Wesley, if I may, one of the risks actually is kind of the opposite. I mean, the good news is there are lots of very thoughtful people in civic society, academia, government who are looking at this and looking at the experience in a range of local and national and global settings. On the other hand, one of the real risks right now is that everybody's attention is only on COVID-19. Every academic that I know now spends all their time on COVID-19. And indeed, if the president were to ask, I would say, look, there's probably 2 or 3 challenges besides COVID-19 you're going to have to worry about. And one of them is helping low and middle income countries to resurrect their health systems before we're back to 1 million children a year dying of measles, before we're back to 20 years ago on polio, before we're back to 600,000 or 700,000 women a year dying in childbirth instead of only 280,000. Another is antimicrobial resistance. I mentioned that last year. This is not going away. It's getting worse. In fact, COVID has made it worse. There's been a lot of really interesting articles because they're throwing antibiotics at everybody, whether they need it or not. And climate change, of course, is the third, which is, doesn't matter how we think it originates. We know that climates are changing, and changing climates has an impact on how people live, what they grow, what they eat, the vectors to which they're subject, et cetera. So I think there's lots of thoughtful information. The literature is almost impossible. I read 3 hours a day, and it's not enough. And that's good, but we really also have to get back to where we're also paying attention to other risks, other challenges, and other threats, and trying to get the world back on the very good trajectory that we faced in many aspects of global health earlier.
Okay, and one from Frank Young. What parallels do you draw between the 1918 influenza pandemic and today's COVID-19 pandemic?
So, I read Professor Berry's, my favorite subject is the social history of medicine, on which I'm not an authority, but I walked down to a canyon full of Native American petroglyphs today with my grandson, and we were discussing the social history of medicine. And the 1918 flu and COVID-19, although I try to be delicate on COVID with him because he's too smart. I'm sure you probably know much better than me, but I think, my understanding is that the parallels are very substantial. And among the most important parallels are what are the measures that different authorities took at different levels of government in those days, and what did we learn about how well they worked? What is the extent to which Woodrow Wilson was open and honest and candid about the 1918 flu epidemic? Or by contrast, because of the war, what was the extent to which he didn't want to talk about it at all, which many people have associated with a substantial number of military deaths? So, my understanding is that I'm a big believer in the social history of medicine. There's an outstanding scholar from Yale, Frank Snowden, who's one of the all-time most wonderful gentlemen and the kind of people they don't even make anymore. And he has a book that's really cheap that was associated with an online course he had that I recommend to all of you, that looks at plagues over time and pandemics over time. I think we'll find that the parallels are substantial in terms of the way viruses behave, the way communities behave, difficulties of creating a consensus, the value of different measures that were taken, which appear to be no different. They had super spreading events in Philadelphia after Mummers Parade, and we had super spreading events here after X, Y, and Z. So I think it's a very valuable question, and it was polite of you not to say, why don't we as a group get together and have a book club and take a look at Professor Berry's book on 1918 and Professor Snowden's book on pandemics and draw for ourselves some valuable conclusions about what we should learn. I think these are very valuable lessons, and we'll find lots of parallels. But I can't speak with authority on them, but that's my understanding.
Okay, and then one more from Virginia Hitchcock. Have there been any efforts to train dogs to identify people with the virus? Dogs have already been used for a series of trials with certain diseases and identifying those diseases within people.
Yeah, I believe there are. I can pick up a few articles for you, but I read every so many days about efforts. I was reading yesterday, I think, about efforts in the UK to train dogs who could sniff out COVID-19 and who, instead of the agriculture department dogs that are looking for bushmeat or cannabis, you would actually have COVID-19 sniffing dogs by the side of people, customs and border control people. So my understanding is there's a substantial amount of work going on in this. Wesley, with your permission, maybe I can go back for 1 second. Parallels. So the history of polio is one of my all-time favorites and a matter on which I have spent an enormous amount of time. And I encourage everyone to read a book by Professor Oshinsky at Texas called The History of Polio in America, which won the Pulitzer. My friends were very gracious and said they were sorry I didn't write that book before he did, because it was the book I wanted to write. But I don't think I could have done as good a job as Professor Oshinsky did. It's a great book. It parallels a movie you can see on PBS called Paralyzing Fear, The History of Polio in America. But just think of this and think of the difference. And I'm not talking politics, I'm talking social action. We had a president who had polio, even though he didn't want anybody to really know it or see it, right? We had a president's advisor who, with the president, helped to create the Mother's March of Dimes. And on a single night in America, people were encouraged to turn on their porch light so the mother down the corner would know that she could leave her family to collect dimes at your door because your light was on, and then mail them at the post office to the Oval Office of the president, where in a newsreel, the president, with Basil O'Connor at his side, turned over sack after sack after sack of dimes collected by the Mother's March of Dimes as society rode in one direction. You take that, and I want you to take the social history of polio in America and compare that to what's going on today, and it's impossible not to be embarrassed to be an American and appalled by what's going on. And I'm not blaming anybody, I'm just saying, when you have people who don't believe the disease exists on their deathbed in South Dakota, right? People who don't believe measures that scientists suggest can help to mitigate the spread of an infection, okay? And super spreading events led from all sorts of political directions or political directions. I understand why you'd have Sturgis, the motorcycle rally, but it was about as stupid a thing as you could do during a pandemic. Compare this with the extent to which America rode in one direction and saw when the University of Michigan announced that the SWAC vaccine was effective, what that meant for people at the time. It was just a completely, utterly different world. And I hope some people who lived in that world will do what they can to try to recapture some of it so we can move as a nation in a more consensual way toward trying get everybody vaccinated as quickly as possible if the vaccines turn out to be safe and effective. But there are enormous anti-parallels with what happened during polio. Even though with polio, it actually took a long time. It took something like 15 years to get rid of polio in the United States. And I see Barbara Hicks, probably read these books and knows more than I do, which is great. But Barbara probably also understands, now we're living, SWAC vaccine, I think, was approved 55. And now it's 45, 65 years later, we're still screwing around as a world trying to eradicate polio. And I say screwing around respectfully, because I have friends who've devoted every ounce of their life, for the last 20 years. There are heroes like Ellen Ogden from USAID, or Bob Davis from UNICEF, or Bob Steinglass, or David Heyman, or others. But I think those parallels are really, 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 really telling.
Well, you already brought her up, so we're going to end on one last question from Barbara Hicks.
I could have read her lips.
Do you have any recommendations for strengthening the World Health Organization's ability to quickly coordinate across countries?
So there are many people much more thoughtful than I who've looked at this earlier, and I think have looked at it again more recently. I think we need, as a global community, to agree on the idea that the World Health Organization needs to be at the summit of the global efforts in health. And I think we need to really confront forcefully what we want it to do, and then be sure that it's funded and staffed in the best, most scientific way to deal with that. And unless we do that, I think WHO is going to continue to try hard to do good work, and sometimes it will, and at other times it will flounder. And as Barbara may know, there's a terrible structural issue at WHO. You know, we think that it's a gigantic international organization that some people think wasting gobs and gobs of money, but actually WHO has a two-part budget. There's one part that funds the core of its work that's funded from all of the member countries in the world. But there's another part that's off budget, that's trust funds that are for specific activities. Nat and I worked in a similar environment, but at the World Bank, 95% of the money was on budget and 5% was trust funds. At WHO, I don't know if it's exactly the opposite, but the budget is a complete non-starter. The WHO faces ridiculous structural issues in terms of the way that it's budgeted. So I think, you know, maybe as things move forward in light of the pandemic, I'm hoping that the world will get tired of facing pandemics in a kind of bulimic way. You know, that we get a pandemic, we deal with it, and then we forget about it, and then we have another health problem, and then we deal with that. And this, as the CSIS and the nuclear threat people and Hopkins said last year, is a completely nonsensical way to go. So I'm hoping that, as partly linked to this, people, Barbara and others, will confront this forcefully, and then at the same time deal with some of the structural issues on the international health regulations. They were revised some years ago, as you probably know. They got stronger. They allowed WHO to consider information from non-sovereign actors. But, you know, I mean, look, no WHO director, no World Bank president, no UNICEF director, except maybe Jim Grant in the olden days, as Nat might know, is going to go tell Xi Jinping, drop dead. You're lying to us. We have sources on the ground. And no, what they have to say is, you know, Mr. President, we admire and greatly respect the people of China, which is a great nation with a great history. And we commend China for the remarkable measures it's taken to deal with this new disease that has emerged on your territory, and to share what you know with the rest of us so that we might also be prepared. But they got to go the next step. And in addition, I hope you'll walk side by side with me, Mr. President, in order to help those other countries and ensure that everything we know is known immediately. You got to find ways. There's this sovereignty block. It's not going to go away. I think Jim Grant, when he was at UNICEF, just didn't care. And he would just say to anybody, your immunization program is terrible. You're not immunizing your children. Go immunize your children. And I'm not going to stop telling the world how terrible you are. WHO can't get away with that. So I think they need to deal with the structure of the budget. They need to get what's important on the budget. They need to take some of the measures others have recommended about strengthening their staff and ensuring that the regional offices are probably not quite so independent and are staffed with better leaders. And they need to deal, I think, with some of the structural issues around the international health regulations and sovereignty. These are not magic. People have been writing about them. People know about them. Short of that, I think we're just going to keep going down the same path. I hope not.
Well, Richard, I don't know how to thank you enough for your usual informative and comprehensive presentation.
And I've been on my good behavior for you, Nat.
And your good behavior as well. We're going to just have to have you back another year. That's all, to continue the reportage. And hopefully it'll be a lot more positive news to report in a year. But again, Richard, I think on behalf of all of our members, I want to thank you very much for your time and insights. Much appreciated.
Let me thank all of you again, and thank Lynn and Wesley and you for so graciously inviting me. I'm really honored to have been invited last year. I'm especially honored to have been invited back. The questions were extraordinarily thoughtful and well stated. I'll do my best to get answers to the few that I didn't even want to go too far out on, because I don't possess the knowledge to give good answers. If people have any questions they think I can help them on it as a clever generalist who tries to keep up with this, please don't hesitate. And I might take the liberty, Nat and Wesley and Lynn, as I find a few things that are relevant to the questions, of passing them on to you so that you might share them with your membership. But I'm very honored. I thank you very much. And I hope everyone stays well and that we're all safely vaccinated, effectively vaccinated, and we can all get together and see petroglyphs around the corner from my house in New Mexico and the beach in Sarasota as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks again, Richard. Now formally closes now. Thanks, everyone.
See you later. Thank you all very much. Thank you.